So when it comes to international relations and geopolitics, there's always an emphasis on the end of the Western order, an anti-Western sort of grouping coming together. And Venezuela right now is learning that that might actually not be the case. You see, for more than 20 years, Venezuela has had, or believed it had, an insurance policy. That if Washington ever pushed too hard, Caracas could rely on Moscow and Beijing. This new world order, a multipolar shield, an axis that will stand up to the wrath and hypocrisy of the United States. But with American military power being what it is, especially now with Donald Trump back, there are American naval forces gathering in the Caribbean, oil tankers being seized, naval vessels being sunk, and Nicolás Maduro learning very publicly and uncomfortably that when the pressure turns real, well, his allies may well not. So in this video, I wanted to explain why Russia and China are, unsurprisingly really, sitting on their hands when it comes to Trump's escalation and pressure on Venezuela, what this moment exposes about the so-called anti-Western movements, or in some cases, authoritarian alliances, and the uncomfortable truth about how power still really works, and the role of alliances or not in international relations. Let's get into it.
This is The Global Gambit.
How you going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel, where if you're new here, well, right now we're coming to you from the lovely town of Rye in southeast England, and where we look at the nexus of geopolitics, international relations, and economic statecraft, trying to understand how global politics really functions once you strip away the slogans, the posturing, and in some ways, utter mythology of social media. You see, today's story is a textbook example of that gap between the narrative and the reality. What people claim is really happening, and ultimately, whilst shifts are occurring, not maybe at the rate or scale that some like to insinuate. Specifically, for years, Venezuela has been held up by its supporters and critics alike as part of a rising multipolar bloc. Proof, supposedly, that American power was or is perpetually declining, that countries can openly defy Washington and survive by aligning themselves with others that are opposed to American hegemony, i.e. Russia and China. The idea mattered far beyond Caracas. It travelled across the global south. It fed into a wider belief that the US-led order was brittle, reversible, and increasingly optional. But moments like these are where those theories really do get tested and ultimately, in some ways, exposed. Because when Trump returned to office and began applying direct pressure militarily, economically, psychologically, Venezuela has been quickly discovering that that multipolar rhetoric doesn't automatically translate into policy or protection. Now, this isn't to say that I agree necessarily with Trump's approach or anything that Trump really stands for, but I do appreciate the opportunity to call out those, of which there are far too many, unfortunately, grossly claiming that the West is in its last years and somehow Russia, China, with all their similarities, or the awkward fact that the Chinese are taking a territory from the Russians, mean that they're going to be working together on a holistic basis in everything to do with diplomacy and relations, which is clearly not the case. And with that, I ask to you, what do you think about this? Whilst Venezuela's developments may not be the primary event around the world, this is a good illustration of these broader roles of power play, about where the balance of power really remains. And despite what is said, what's actually done is what's most important. And sometimes, as I constantly emphasize on the channel, the less you say can actually speak far more. But let me know in the comments below. So what's actually happening? Well, over the past weeks, as many of you well know, the United States has sharply escalated pressure on Venezuela in ways that go well beyond diplomatic signaling or minor law enforcement. Washington has surged its air and naval assets into the Caribbean, including surveillance aircraft, warships, and according to multiple reports, even nuclear-powered submarines. US forces have conducted repeated strikes on boats accused of drug trafficking, operations that have killed more than 80 people. And most provocatively, American authorities have now seized an oil tanker off the Venezuelan coast, an act that Caracas has immediately denounced as piracy. Now, officially, the Trump administration insists this is about counter-narcotics, sanctions, law enforcement, and organized crime. That language matters because it provides legal and political cover for escalation, something that I've covered in previous videos. But Maduro and most independent analysts see something else taking shape. They see a familiar playbook: sustained pressure designed to weaken the regime, isolate its leadership, and test just how far Caracas can be pushed from within before it fractures. Whether or not regime change is the explicit objective, the message is unmistakable. Venezuela is once again a live target in Washington's strategic calculations, and that places Maduro in the most precarious position he has faced in decades. Though, as a side note, one has to wonder why Trump is particularly agitated by Nicolás Maduro wannabe dictatorship when he's all well and happy to get pretty cozy up with Putin over Ukraine. The inconsistencies there pretty glaring. But to understand this moment, let's zoom back and understand the Maduro-US-Trump relationship. Venezuela's confrontation with the US did not begin with Trump's return. It has been building for more than a decade through sanctions, this diplomatic isolation, and repeated attempts to force political change in Caracas. Under Hugo Chavez, high oil prices allow Venezuela to absorb a lot of that pressure. Oil revenues funded generous social programs at home and brought political loyalty abroad. Caracas could afford defiance because it had that cash, leverage, confidence. But after Chavez's death in 2013, that model greatly changed. Oil production fell off a cliff, mismanagement and corruption hollowed out state institutions. Sanctions tightened, hyperinflation spiraled, and millions of Venezuelans left the country, draining the state of human capital and legitimacy. By the time Trump first left office, Venezuela was already economically crippled and politically polarized. His return to power doesn't create a new crisis, therefore. It simply reignites one that Trump feels is unresolved. The difference now is that Venezuela is weaker, its economy much more fragile, and its supposed allies are dealing with crises of their own. The world that we live in compared to 7-8 years ago is even more unstable. We've had COVID, we've had the war in Ukraine, we've got continuing tensions between China and America, we've had the situation in the Middle East. The list is endless, and in some ways, during the Biden administration, Venezuela actually got a minor reprieve when sanctions were loosened because the Biden administration were worried about the global impact on oil access and prices given Putin's invasion into Ukraine. But then that brings us to the central question. Why, at the moment, Maduro needs the most are Moscow and Beijing seemingly rather muted, keeping their distance? You see, under Hugo Chavez, Venezuela spent years deliberately cultivating anti-American partners, anti-American sentiment. China financed housing, telecoms, and infrastructure. Loans repaid in oil. Russia, they supplied weapons, training, and various diplomatic covers at the UN. Iran, Cuba, and even Belarus played supporting roles in what Caracas framed as an emerging counter-order. The assumption being straightforward. If Washington ever pushed too far, Venezuela would be supported. But today, as Maduro faces renewed US pressure, the contrast between expectation and reality couldn't be more stark. If anything, it's kind of entertaining. What has he actually received? Carefully worded statements, phone calls expressing solidarity, symbolic gestures, heck, even birthday wishes. But that's about it. And there are a few reasons, but one of them most obviously being geography. Venezuela is far away. Its proximity to any of its neighboring states is not exactly great. China and Russia right next door. Iran not too far away. North Korea, those groupings, they're all tight. But Venezuela, you've got a couple of oceans, a big continent known as Africa in the way, meaning it's just pragmatically, logistically, physically hard to sustain any military backing if a conflict of some kind were to occur. Indeed, look at Russia. On paper, Russia remains Venezuela's closest ally. Putin has spoken with Maduro. Russian officials insist that Moscow supports Venezuela just as Venezuela supports Russia. But in practice, that support becomes entirely rhetorical. Since invading Ukraine 3.5 years ago, Russia has poured enormous resources into a grinding war that strains its military, its finances, its diplomatic capital. Sanctions, while not doing enough to collapse the economy, do narrow its options. Defense production is prioritized for Russia's self-interests and its battlefields. And Moscow's tolerance for new risks has dropped sharply. We can see that in Africa, as I made just a day ago about Russia's activities or the collapse of its campaign across the Western Sahel in Africa. Or even at home abroad, in their near sphere of the Caucasus, where Russia's inability to come to the defense of Armenia has seen them effectively sign a peace deal with Azerbaijan, reducing and changing years of international and military tension. That is not something that Moscow would do if they didn't have military overextension. In Syria, Russia maintains a presence but avoids escalation. In Iran, Moscow offered political cover but no military intervention when tensions spiked. And Russia still speaks like it's a global power, but increasingly behaves like one forced to make hard trade-offs. And nowhere is that more evident than with the geopolitical proximity and distance of Venezuela. Venezuela simply does not rank high enough to justify additional sanctions, confrontation with the United States, especially in its own backyard, or direct military escalation. Not now, and not likely ever. Then there comes China. China's different in that its calculation is even colder, and as always more transactional and longer term. Beijing has no interest in military confrontation with the US in the Western Hemisphere, particularly on behalf of a regime with collapsing institutions, disputed elections, and frankly, limited strategic upside. Its priorities, as most states, is near abroad in South and Eastern Asia. China has lent Venezuela tens of billions of dollars. It's sold hundreds of millions of dollars worth of military equipment, and it does buy Venezuelan oil. But the relationship that once looked like strategic partnerships has steadily morphed into, frankly, damage control and reputational risk for Beijing. Chinese lending has slowed to a trickle. Major infrastructure projects have been abandoned, and Beijing's priority today is not propping up Maduro, but about recovering outstanding debts through these oil shipments. Simultaneously, China is trying to stabilize its own relationship with Washington. After the years of the tariff escalation and back and forth in the past months, the recent Xi-Trump meetings have reopened the possibility of limited trade accommodation. They're not going to jeopardize that over a long-distant country in America's backyard. Defending Maduro, militarily or financially, would be absolutely a strategic blunder. And privately, many Chinese analysts assume that any post-Maduro government would seek pragmatic relations with Beijing anyway. Therefore, from China's perspective, patience beats loyalty hands down. Lastly, there is also a legitimacy issue neither Moscow nor Beijing can fully ignore. Venezuela's July 2024 election was widely criticized as fraudulent. The electoral authority released no detailed results. The opposition published records suggesting its candidate won, and Mayor Corina Machado, now a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, emerged as the symbolic face of that. Supporting Maduro under these conditions isn't therefore just about money, or it's not about it being expensive. It's the reputational risk that I want to double underline. Both China and Russia may object to the United States' operations in principle, but neither wants to be seen as backing a leader with collapsing domestic support and a deeply contested mandate. Of course, they will use this as an opportunity to criticize America for its neo-expansionist or hypocritical methods, but they're not going to lend a hand physically. More broadly, for years, commentators have spoken confidently about this idea of a anti-Western axis, an axis of autocracy, as I call it. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, or Venezuela, united. But moments like this reveal the limitations of that idea. And this axis always looks stronger in peacetime. It sounds formidable in these joint press releases, these joint commitments. But under pressure, the fragmentation appears. We saw it with Iran earlier this year, and we're seeing it right now with Venezuela. These regimes cooperate when the costs are low. They issue statements when the risks are manageable, but when real military or economic wartime danger appears, self-preservation always comes first. Multipolarity does exist, but it is far more conditional and transactional than advocates like to admit, and compared to the perhaps more values-based system we have in the West. Now, what actually happens then? Well, Maduro is not entirely abandoned. Russia does continue limited technical support. Iranian and Russian fuel shipments still arrive. China still purchases crude. But none of this will matter if Washington continues to escalate. It highly depends on what America, or specifically Trump, wants to do. And his statements about he doesn't have long doesn't indicate some kind of peaceful resolution. Venezuela will stand largely alone. And that's the real story here, not just about Venezuela, but about the global direction of things. Alliances built on ideology are weaker than alliances built on deeper institutions, and regimes that bet their survival on distant patrons often discover too late that those patrons have other priorities. But that's it from me, everyone. Let me know in the comments below what you think about this. Is this a bit of a non-story, not really important, or does the symbolism behind it? As we talk about great power politics, great power competition on this channel a lot, I'd be interested to know what you think. My name is Pyotr Kurzin. This is the Global Gambit. And if you want to understand where global power is quietly shifting and who's being left exposed, you know what to do by checking out the links in the description below, where you can buy me a coffee or support me further by becoming a member on the Patreon. And we'll see you all in the next one. Take care.